There she is. Okay, so tier 2 implementation also does not happen by accident. So this is where you all come in and are in your learning phase, and then there'll be a little phase in which you are practicing and trying to work things out and learning still, but trying to help schools along the way. And then you're going to be the point person and the person with the fancy badge who knows what to do for tier 2. But it is going to take some learning and thinking through logistical issues that are there locally. So I just want to recognize that too. PBIS doesn't happen by accident either. This triangle should be very, very familiar to all of you. Tina and I actually met, we're both on the board of directors for the Association for Positive Behavior Support. And so that service obligation for us brought us together. And really, just so everyone knows, I know you guys get PBIS in Pennsylvania, but there's this huge network of people working hard and doing this work all across the world, really. And in the US, we have more than 26,000 schools implementing. And I'm so glad that Tina mentioned systems, data, and practices, because a lot of times when we're talking systems, data, practices, we're talking about tier 1. And I hope to show you guys how we can apply those 3 pillars to tier 2 as well. So in the module, the first module, you'll see that I spend a good amount of time talking about readiness for tier 2. A big criteria for a very important criteria for being ready for tier 2 is that the school is implementing tier 1 to fidelity. We have had some schools who want to skip and before they get to fidelity at tier 1 and start with tier 2. And a lot of what we see there is that we are overusing tier 2 if we do that. So we do want to make sure there are some pieces in place that make sure tier 1 is in place. And then we want to extend out from tier 1. So we're still going to link everything back to systems, data, and practice. Our schools understand that logic and that language. So instead of kind of starting something new for them, we're going to link on and expand what they do. So you can see with the yellow triangle to the right, kind of what that looks like for tier 2. And we're all very used to the green column in the middle. And then I hopefully will get you guys thinking about systems, data, and practices for tier 2. So to set the stage, we are going to examine those 3 things all throughout all the modules. Some of them focus more on systems. You've got several that focus on practices. So those are tier 2 evidence-based interventions. And then you have some also that talk about data. So I'm going to preview those for you today and just give you a kind of overview. Feel free to jump in or raise your hand. Maybe I'll see that if you need me to slow down. But this is really just intended to be an overview. So if you're not absorbing everything I'm saying, that's okay. We all know as educators, it takes a few repetitions for us all to gain new knowledge. So this is maybe day 1, repetition number 1 for all of you. So in tier 2, like tier 1 actually, when we talk about systems, we're talking about the teaming, the resources needed in professional development. So the same is going to hold true for tier 2. When we talk about teaming on tier 2, we have specific criteria of who is on a tier 2 team, who we need. There aren't a lot of them, so it's kind of open beyond these 3 criteria here. So someone with behavioral expertise, someone who has knowledge of students and across the building. And then of course, we always need someone with administrative authority on the team too. You will see once you get out there, unless PA has a very standardized way of doing this, that your schools will want to think through tier 2 teaming in different ways. I just have some examples here of tier 2 teams and thinking that we've seen in Alabama and Texas. So you may even come up with new ideas. We have a lot of teams who wonder whether or not they could combine a tier 2 and tier 3 team. We have most of ours consider it one team across tier 2 for behavior and academics. Here we call that the PST, the problem solving team. They do both behavior and academics, and you will see that makes a lot of sense, especially when we have co-occurring needs across academics and behavior, because they are actually very tied and difficult to tease apart anyway. We have some that do a tier 2 team at each grade level. And then if they're doing it that way, there would be one team with kind of administrative oversight of the whole building. So different things you may see there and here, and just start thinking through the schools that you know and how they might like to do those. Of course, as with all PBIS, we're going to need some structure around our meetings. So meeting frequency, format, we'll talk about roles, documentation, and action planning, and give you some examples of documents that we use here and have created. So any of those are yours to adapt and make work for you. I don't know if you guys are Google people, if all of your schools use Google, but we've also adapted almost everything that we have into Google as well. And then we'll need to talk about resources. One of the things that we do before we get started with tier 2 training is we give our schools a little Google form survey. And one of the most important questions on that survey is, what resources do you have at your school to do tier 2? Because if they have something or they have someone, we want to try to leverage that rather than starting over or spending money or finding and hiring people when we could have leveraged someone or something that's already in the building. So there are resources required for tier 2. This is kind of not a shocker for anyone, but it is where a lot of people get hung up. Because tier 2 is not special education, it does not come with extra people or funding, as does special education funding. So this is, one of those things that we have to talk to our general educators about. And sometimes they're very happy to use their basic classroom management strategies and your school-wide universal tier 1 system. And when you start asking them to also implement tier 2 across social, emotional, behavioral needs, sometimes they can feel overwhelmed. As a preview, if you hadn't already thought that through. So we also want to leverage all humans in the building. And you will hear me say, all hands on deck. You do not need a master's degree in education to implement most of the evidence-based tier 2 interventions. So we actually get really creative. A grandparent volunteer, front office staff, custodian, bus drivers, PE coaches, athletic coaches. So while tier 2 is often considered a classroom level intervention, they do require grown-ups in most cases. Sometimes we can have some peer-mediated interventions, and that helps. But we'll need some people. So these would be the check-in, check-out mentors, the grown-ups who are working with the student on goal setting or behavior contracting, those sorts of things. Even social skills lessons can be delivered by somebody who can read a script. Most of those are pretty scripted. So just be starting to think outside the box on resources and who can do the work. And then obviously you should continue to attend professional development. You're with me for an entire year. So we are considering that your initial training, and then we have this year of follow-up, but we do want to make sure, and with all of your skills that you're using, that you're ongoing learning and keeping up to date on things. So these are kind of questions or wonderings for you to start thinking through on your own. You can kind of take down notes. You can even put things in the chat, although I will not see them because I'm still talking. But just some wonderings around systems now that we've gone through and previewed those systems for you. So the questions are, what do you see as systems-based challenges to implementation of tier 2? And then what do you see as possible solutions? So kind of thinking through what this may start to look like in your schools that you support. So then moving forward, we're going to go on to practices. And Tina was right. I've spent a lot of time researching tier 2. That also includes doing an entire come through of evidence-based interventions for students who did not have special education identifications. So therefore, we're not on tier 3 or special education, but who were included as participants in studies for interventions that were statistically significant or had a functional relation. So we went through the literature, we figured out all the different interventions that have evidence to support those interventions. And then we looked at the participants and how they describe the participants for which those interventions worked best. So we have done all that work for you. You do not have to go back through the Tier 2 literature unless you really would like to. But we know a few things about the requirements to make something Tier 2. And there are some blurry lines between Tier 2 and Tier 3. We'll especially talk about function and function adaptations in some of our lifetime together. So for Tier 2 practices, to be Tier 2 practices, there are a few characteristics. They have to provide additional feedback, additional access to instruction, additional structure in the student's day, and can be delivered in small groups. We also want to be able to match Tier 2 interventions to student need, and then have interventions that are pliable enough to adapt to student need. Just like everything we do with PBIS, we want to make sure we're culturally responsive and differentiating to student needs. So we'll talk quite a bit about adaptations too. That's a really fun discussion to have synchronous, because it can get a bit in the weeds. So these interventions also need to be readily available. That's why they're not intensive, individualized behavior intervention plans, aligned with Tier 1 expectations when possible, be able to be delivered in small groups, and then require minimal commitment. That's where really that all hands on deck comes through, along with the easy to implement. So we have to have multiple interventions available at each school. A lot of times when we go in before we start Tier 2, it's one of the questions on the Google form I was telling you about that you'll have. We ask what Tier 2 interventions are available. And they say, for social emotional behavioral needs at our school, if you're on Tier 2, you get check-in, check-out. And then I wait, and I say, well, what else do you get? Well, you get check-in, check-out. Okay. So a lot of times what we see, that's better than nothing. But we see this one size fits all approach. And what we want to do is make sure that it's actually differentiated to meet the needs of each student. So here are some examples of why we wouldn't do this in any other areas of our lives. So if you are, my colleague on this is a softball coach, I'm a soccer coach. But I'm kind of understanding the baseball at this point with a child who plays baseball. But she would ask you, what do you do when your pitcher is struggling to throw strikes? What do you do when your child is coughing and sneezing? What do you do when a child is struggling academically? So all those answers, we are probably all thinking, I would try to figure out the root cause. I would try to figure out what's actually going on, what's underlying. Is the pitcher tired? Is the pitcher standing on the mound wrong? Is it the catcher, and the catcher's not showing the pitcher a good strike zone? That's as far as my baseball knowledge goes. But the point is that you would try to figure out the root cause, and then you would put something in place that addresses the root cause. So if the pitcher was just tired, you wouldn't change what the catcher is doing. You would rest your pitcher or give them a Gatorade or something. So the same holds true with Tier 2. We have educators who understand this analogy very well. So everyone knows about literacy instruction. Literacy is this huge umbrella, as is behavior, okay? So mostly when we say behavior, we're actually talking about social, emotional, and behavioral needs. So it gets a little bit more nuanced than just behavior. And then in the area of literacy, we usually are talking about all of these different categories here. So they're under language comprehension alone, you have 5. Under word recognition, you have 3. So you have the main umbrella, and then you have these domains of skills that fit to help support what in the ultimate wraparound is your rope at the end there is fluent social, emotional, behavioral wellness. So that would be ours. If you see here, that same rope analogy is you have behavioral learning, you have social emotional learning. You bring those two things together with all the different kind of subdomains they have, and then you end up with your rope at the end there is skilled social emotional behavioral well-being. That's what we're going for. So we have to actually be able to parse out and identify using data where the need is for the student, just like we would for literacy. So we want to attack the area of need or area of deficit instead of all of them or the wrong one, right? So we have to use this matching process. If you haven't taken a look at the TFI for Tier 2, the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, this would be a good time to do that and just kind of norm yourself to those items. I would love to see if you guys are collecting TFI data a pre-TFI Tier 2, and then when you get to them and provide them with some supports and coaching and intervention materials, kind of looking at that post TFI Tier 2. But there are specific items that say you have to match the interventions to the student's area of need. And so that is 2.5 and 2.7 under the TFI. So this is definitely a requirement that we can't skip and use a one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, so in order to match and to do all of the things we need to do in Tier 2, once the student has been assigned to a Tier 2 intervention, we have to address that circle that is, so systems, practice, data. So we land on data and remind ourselves we're always making data-based decisions. So when we start out, our very first piece of data or pieces of data that we're going to look at is the screening process. So we have to match, but to back up from there, we have to figure out who is identified for Tier 2 and who isn't. What does their ODR data look like? Is there a function related to their behavior? Should we do any function data collection? And even consider those academic measures. So remember when I talked about some of the teams they serve both social, emotional, behavioral, and academic needs. This is where we can start to look at those data together and how they interact with each other. So we know our students who are escape maintained and they don't feel confident in math and will throw a chair to get out of math instruction, right? We can't take away the fact that part of that behavior is a math confidence issue, so related to academics. You'll see that we want to start with screening, and everything in your modules is going to describe how this works using the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. So it'll be called the SDQ when you see me talking about it. And the reason why we landed on this one for the 5-step framework that you'll use, that is definitely adaptable, is it is only 25 items. It is free, so you'll get a copy of it, and it has the formulas in there that calculate the total score and then all the subscale scores for you. And it has really great subscale domains for us to match intervention to that it yields. So it yields a total score, and then it has these subscale scores. So because of that, and our schools don't have any money to purchase a universal screening system. So this is something here locally that is very attractive to our educators. So 25 items. The one you're looking at here is the teacher version. There is a parent version and a child version. Also, just so you know, we ignore this little page of extra work off to the right. Nobody actually ever fills that in because educators just don't have a lot of time. So we focus on the 25 items, and I will show you how the framework works with that. As you can see on the right-hand side of this score report, what the SDQ gives you is an overall score or a total score. That's your risk assessment, overall risk assessment. So that'll be actually who's in for Tier 2 and who's not. And then it gives you these subscale scores. So for the SDQ, it's emotional, conduct or behavioral, hyperactivity and inattention, and then social. And then there's one area of strength, which we love any screener that's going to help us identify areas of strength and try to make strength-based planning part of Tier 2. We can get really caught up in deficit areas where students have areas of need, and it's really nice to detect an area of strength. For the SDQ, it would be kind and helpful behavior. So you may have a student who's has a lot of emotional symptoms or can't focus on a lesson, but is very kind and helpful. So we want to leverage that strength if we're able to detect it on a screener like this. So that's a little preview of the SDQ, but I do want to let you know that there are other screeners used locally there in Pennsylvania and all over the country, actually, that we can modify too. So I'm going to highlight for you the two that I've been told are also common in your schools. So one is the SABRS, and also known as FAST, I think. But the SABRS is a great screener. If you have schools using the SABRS, they do not need to change anything that they're doing for to fit in this 5-step framework. We actually have already, I work with Steve Kilgus, and we've already developed an adapted kind of what you'll see eventually, which would kind of make your brains explode if I showed it to you right now. But the whole matrix and graphic organizer of categories of intervention and least to most resource intensive, we've already fit the SABRS in there. It's actually a pretty natural and easy fit. So the SABRS does yield a total or overall risk score. That's going to help you figure out who needs tier 2. And then their subscales are worded a little bit differently than the SDQ, but they call them adaptive, externalizing, social, and then internalizing or emotional, one of those two. So their subscales fit really easily in with what the SDQ does. So those two are pretty similar. I think they're pretty similar in length too. I can't remember exactly how many items SABRS is. And I think it has a minimal cost to it, just as a difference. But if they're already using the SABRS, that's totally fine. And we will continually come back to this conversation about leveraging existing screeners. I actually have, this is an example in case this is a question you were going to ask me. I have a district here locally that, how were they going to do it? Oh, they were going to use one screener as the identification screener. And then if they needed more information, they were going to do a second screener for the subdomains or the subscales. And we were like, whoa, that is totally a lot of work and probably not necessary. So we don't necessarily need to be doing 2 screeners unless that first screener is already embedded in everything they do. And then asking teachers to do this again, just to find the subscale scores, might be a lot of resources around that. So that said, I do want to highlight the SRSSIE because I know you guys use that too. So you will see a total risk score on that screener. The issue here is going to become that the subscales that is giving you a number on are only internalizing versus externalizing. So what happens here is internalizing pretty simple. So that matches up with emotional symptoms, and that category is pretty easy. That's an easy fit. Externalizing, as they're calling it, could be several things that fit within more nuanced domains in the SDQ or the SABRS, which are, it could be actually a social issue at its root cause. It could be a conduct or aggression, impulse control kind of issue, or it could be more of a hyperactivity, inattention, focus kind of issue. So within externalizing, there's probably actually 3 subcategories that fit within that. So we'll just have to do some creative thinking. I'm going to show you kind of what I'm thinking that we'll do when we're making those decisions. If your schools are going to use the SRSSIE or RDR. It is also very brief. It's actually shorter than SDQ. I think it's 6 items. So in that way, that's a win. That's great. And I don't think that one is cost-free either. I don't know the cost associated with it, but if you look at this is part of the framework that you'll see in the 5 steps. So what I just want you starting to think about with those different screeners is these are the different categories of, remember going back to that braid. So if we untangle the braid, these are really the main categories of social, emotional, and behavioral needs. So emotional symptoms is simple. If you kind of look at what would be under that category. So those are your somatic symptoms like tummy aches and headaches. Those are sleeping a lot in class and being disengaged from your peers. So those are kind of those quiet, non-referred to the office kinds of behaviors that if all we're looking at is ODRs, we're going to overlook all of our kids with emotional symptoms. So we don't want to do that. Once you get to conduct, hyperactivity, and peer problems, this is really, those 3 collapse down on the SRSS into externalizing problem behavior. So conduct is really your aggression and deviant behavior. So even bullying or threats of aggression, verbal aggression, physical aggression, and then your deviant behaviors are going to be more like lying, stealing, cheating, which sounds very scandalous, but that's all kind of fits within what we call conduct. And then hyperactivity and attention are going to be students who have needs that are related to raising their hand and staying on task and completing assignments. This is a kind of adaptive part of the SABRs that we would call the kind of more academic related behaviors, that they only occur during academic instruction time. And then peer problems. And then actually, it doesn't even have to be peer. It can be with younger children and then also adults. This would be your social skills area. So if at the root cause, the actual problem is, I have a problem with other humans, it requires another human to be in the room when I have the problem, then we have to address those issues in a very targeted way that promotes problem solving and conflict resolution and social skills, pro-social skills. So we have to be kind of nuanced in how we address those problems that may eventually look like punching somebody in the face. But when you get down to the root cause of the problem, it's that I lose on the playground when we're playing Foursquare and I can't stand to lose. And I don't know how to be a good sport when I lose. And so I punch people in the face. So you have to kind of look at the behavior, but then tease it down to what's causing the behavior, because that's where we want to intervene. That's our intervention point, is once we figure out what it is. So we'll keep having conversations about those different screeners and how we can match intervention with the information that we have. We have other information available that can inform those decisions. So we'll keep talking about that. Okay, next is progress monitoring. So once we place a student on a tier 2 intervention, they do not remain on check-in, check-out. When they come to college at the University of Alabama, I am not signing check-in, check-out forms. So that means we have to actually monitor progress. We have to make database decisions around the data that we're gathering. So we have to gather progress monitoring data. And this is a little bit of a juggernaut in our field on finding really good data to use as progress monitoring data. So it's a little bit of a difficult thing, but it's something we really need to attend to so that we know, do we continue? Do we adapt? Do we intensify? Do we fade? So those are all really important decisions when it comes to tier 2, because obviously the point is we want them back in tier 1 and no longer needing tier 2. But that means we're not just going to cut off a tier 2 intervention that's working all of a sudden. We've got to fade. If it's not working, we're going to adapt, make sure that it's culturally responsive and responsive to the students' interests and choices. And then eventually, if it's not working, we're going to intensify and move on to a different intervention. So to make all those decisions, we need some sort of data to guide us. So we'll talk a lot about that, the database progress monitoring, that's really important at tier 2. Okay, so that takes us to the adaptation. So this is going to be one of our really good discussions. Like I said before, we can get really into the weeds. There are tons of adaptation ideas on how to make tier 2 work. The one thing I'll tell you that we've learned the most is, I always say this and I don't know how else to say it, but there is no tier 2 holy water that we can pour over a student's head. All of the interventions that are evidence-based interventions for tier 2, we need the students to participate in. So if they don't like the intervention, or if they have to carry around a bright orange piece of paper that's embarrassing because they're in 8th grade, they're not going to do it. They're going to rip it up, or they're going to hide it, or it's not going to work. So we have to modify the interventions in a way that the student will participate with us, because there's just nothing that we could do to the student to improve the behavior without their participation with us. And that brings up another data issue that we'll talk about, which is fidelity. So we talk about fidelity, we look at fidelity on other things. We would always use our medication to fidelity. We wouldn't expect it to work if we didn't. So it's very important that we pay attention to the exact ingredients that make an intervention evidence-based. If we change too many of those core ingredients, it's no longer that intervention. And so we wouldn't expect the outcomes. So what I usually say is students do not have an opportunity to benefit from an intervention that they did not experience or receive. So sometimes when we're saying, well, Johnny just has, he is still throwing books in the classroom every time we're in math, and Johnny's just not getting any better. Well, the first thing we're going to do is check. did we put the intervention in place that we said we would put it in place? Are all of the pieces of that intervention actually in place? Or did we skip some, or did we skip some days, or did we skip some weeks? So the first check that we're going to always look at when it looks like the student isn't responding, we're going to check to see whether or not we did our jobs. So did the adults do their part as far as putting the intervention in place with fidelity? If not, then we go back to that. We don't go back to a student non-responding. This also comes up on the TFI. It's item 2.12 around fidelity, making sure that we're obtaining some sort of record of fidelity of these interventions being put in place. So Tina has more housekeeping stuff, or maybe not, maybe we're done, but I wanted to make sure to wrap up in time. I do have one activity for you all. If you would put in the chat, I think we were doing the chat, Tina, some way of participating. This is my email address, by the way. And Tina will tell you I'm very quick at responding. I love responding to emails. So do not be afraid to email me. I'm not even being sarcastic. So the prompt, the participation for today, and then I'll open it up for questions, is what are your goals for this course? So that was your 40-minute preview of tier 2, and it's some time sitting with modules and practicing and looking at the materials. But overall, why did you sign up? What are your goals? What are you hoping to be able to do or to learn from this course? This information will be good database problem solving for me. So if everybody has a really specific kind of narrow focus of what you'd like to learn, I can kind of change things up. Or if you have something in mind, like you work in residential or alternative schools or anything like that, it would be helpful for me too. So I don't see the chat exploding yet, but if you can put your answer to the prompt, what are your goals for this course? There we go. In the chat, I appreciate your participation. And then I will unshare so that we can all have a little discussion and see each other. And then I'm happy to answer questions. Are you back with us where you can wrap us up or add any housekeeping stuff you had?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I can't see anything on my computer, so I have no housekeeping things. But if Shonda or Catherine can help out with any of the questions that you have there, we'll be good.
Perfect.
So primarily, I see goals in the chat. I'm not seeing any questions thus far. But just as a reminder, if you can make sure that you have that Schoology code. If you came late and you didn't get the Schoology code, thank you. They put that back in the chat. So make sure you have the code to the Schoology course. Make sure you get in there and look at the introduction, look at module 1 before our next meeting, where we will be discussing the content of module 1. I'm trying to think if there are any additional questions. Sarah provided you with her email. So if you had a specific question for her, you could send her an email. And then of course, you could always send a message to Tina or myself if you had questions regarding the structure of the Schoology course, a question about the credential or the Credly badge.
And I did see one question, and then I have a question for you guys, actually. I saw one question: how long are the modules? So I think each video is around 20 minutes, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So they're
Sarah,
not
just so you know, Sarah, in the letter that each independent facilitator received that I focused on at the beginning, every module time is on that letter. So they will see how long each module takes, but they will not have access to the modules till after each segment is synchronously done this way. So they only have access to the materials for module 1 right now.
Perfect. So my question for you all is, do you see the participants here turning this around in real time, or do you want them completing the entire course before turning around portions of it?
Shonda, do you want me to respond to that one?
No, I was going to say, I think as facilitators, we learn content and we apply it as the opportunity presents itself. So I know many of us provide tier 2 or advanced tier training to teams already. So this will be a way for us to enhance that training as well as enhance the technical assistance that we're able to provide to existing teams. So real time.
Okay, because that actually helps me, because I really want you guys to go try out some of these things and then bring back what you did try out in real time, and we can problem solve that. I see our sessions as more like hangouts or office hours or troubleshooting and all those sorts of things. So that actually is a really great way. My suggestion would be to start small. If you have one school that you have a really good relationship with, who's not overwhelmed completely right now and is looking for something, just like most work we do, we kind of scale up. So if you want to start out on the turnaround of this information, if you want to start out small, that might be a good idea.
Mm-hmm. And Karen, you had a question. What will we be doing during the synchronous coaching? And Sarah just touched upon that. So following up from the information that you see in the modules, one of your requirements in the Schoology is that after you go through the content of a module, before you come to a coaching session, that you develop either a discussion point or a question that you would have. And so we will be addressing any questions or discussion prompts that you've created in the Schoology course when we have our synchronous meetings. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. And I don't believe in holding people just to hold them. So Sarah, thank you so much for providing this introduction. I want to thank all of our local facilitators and our patent points of contact. I see a lot of patent points of contact on here as well. I feel like this is going to be a great year and a wonderful opportunity for us all to learn with you. So lots of thank yous in the chat.
Thank you all. I will see you in November. Enjoy, and feel free to email me.
Great. We'll just hold on for for a minute or two in case people have a question or anything like that. All right. I think it's, yeah. I think it's just us patent folks now. So thanks so much, Sarah.
Yay, no problem. Will you download this, whatever we call it, download the chat, export the chat, and
Let me
send it
stop
to
the
me?
recording.